All right, welcome back to I believe, seventh lesson in this preparation and reviews materials um, that I'm putting together for you guys. I um, As of right now, I think this is going to be the last one. In the future, it may not be, but as these are being put together during the coronavirus thing, and I'm just trying to do the best that I can do. So we're going to be talking about synthesis today, and this will only have one lesson on synthesis because essentially synthesis is just building upon the concepts of rhetorical analysis and argumentation that we've already covered. So it really just adds one extra little layer to the things that you should already kind of uh, be familiarizing yourselves with. So just one lesson here. As always, um, the information here is taken from our textbook in the class, The Language of Composition, Reading, Writing, Rhetoric, but with some of my own stuff thrown in there for your and my benefit. So let's get started talking about synthesis. So let's start with a definition. The definition should clarify the picture over to the right. So what is synthesis when we're talking about it in terms especially of this English class? Synthesis is the act of connecting information from multiple sources in order to create and defend an original argument. So the key things that you need to take from this are, you know, connect the act of connection, right? That you're drawing connections, that you're taking multiple sources, and that you're creating an original argument. Connection, multiple sources, original argument. And you can see some of that illustrated off to the right. We've got multiple sources, and they're showing kind of where they overlap or where they connect. What you're not seeing in the picture is the original argument. So that's where we may need to focus a little bit more. Essentially, synthesis requires of you to implement three skills. So let's talk about what those skills are. Skill number one is your ability to see connections between texts. So whereas before with the rhetoric stuff, especially rhetorical analysis, you may have just been looking at, or you probably were just looking at one text and looking at, what's the rhetorical situation of that single text or the text that you're creating. Maybe if it's not one that you're reading, you're creating a single text, and then you're analyzing how that source is making use of rhetorical appeals to accomplish its purpose. Um, in this case, you're going to need to be able to see connections between how multiple texts do that kind of thing. Um, you're also going to need, in order to be able to see connections, you're going to need to be able to set aside your opinions, and you're going to need to be able to read those texts on their own terms. So really to see connections between these texts, you're going to have to come with as much of a clean slate as possible, recognize your biases, and set them aside so that you can read a text on its own terms. And once you're reading a text without that filter of your bias, or at least recognizing your bias, you're going to start to see connections more and more often. You should also, in looking for connections between texts, be seeking out texts that contradict um, that contradict your own biases in order to help you develop your own argument. Again, the act of synthesis is something that's combining skills that you should have worked on with rhetoric and argumentation in order to accomplish what synthesis is asking you to accomplish. And argumentation is going to be an aspect of it. And in order to do that, you're going to have to be able to look at texts from dissenting places. Skill number two is for you to be able to reconsider your preconceived notions. So if you're going to do synthesis well, you're going to have to be aware of your biases. You're going to have to also be willing and able to take what those biases have kind of forced you in a way to the conclusions that you've kind of been forced into by your bias, and you're going to have to be willing and able to reconsider them. You have to go in with the open mind of saying, like, well, depending on what I'm exposed to, depending on the connections that I see between different texts and between dissenting positions, I may need to adjust my opinion here. And that goes back to something that we talked about with Rogerian arguments and being able to compromise, right? So that's a skill for synthesis. You need to be able to sound reasonable, logical, sincere, and informed when you're doing synthesis. And you're also going to need to respect complexity and recognize that there are always more than two sides of an argument. There's always more than two sides of any topic. And the only way that you're going to be able to respect that complexity is you're going to need to be able to reconsider any preconceived notions that you have. The final skill that you're going to need is the ability to qualify your positions, which means that once you've seen the connections and once you have gone through the process of reconsidering, depending on what you've found, then the act of qualifying is um, is making sure that you're not seeing an argument as black and white or zero sum, but that almost always you're going to need to find some kind of middle ground between positions. That's what when anybody says qualify, your argument, they're telling you to look more deeply at the nuances in order to find some kind of middle ground on something. So with those skills in mind, let's review where we've already been with how we make claims. So this is going back to our lessons on argumentation. I'm not going to do the whole reveal thing here because this is literally just the same graphic that you should have seen in a previous lesson, but let's just look at what it says. Remember that when we make claims, we have to do research, we have to consider what that research is telling us, and we have to rethink um, what um, what what we may have already thought about our topic. So when we start with our question and then we use that question to explore the information, we then take that information and we discuss it with people, we discuss it with ourselves, we compare our thoughts um, uh, and others' thoughts on the information. We really consider or process that information, and then we take that information and we talk about it in terms of our biases and we start to consider multiple options. You can see where this process is asking us to draw upon the skills for synthesis. It's just that synthesis is just a little bit more complicated than that. And so when we're talking about creating a synthesis claim, then really what we're doing is taking all of those sources and seeing all of the connections between them and having and this process of research and consideration and rethinking is helping us do that. Um, and then we're making an informed claim about what we've found. Now, all of this sounds very similar to argumentation. I get that, but I'm getting to where we're going with synthesis in just a second. So when we're synthesizing, when we are drawing all those connections together, we're taking it all and we're making an informed and original claim, right? Our claim needs to be something new in synthesis. We're seeing connections that weren't seen before or that, other people haven't seen yet. And the claim that we're coming out with is not just your standard pot boiler claim that you may have used in an argument before, or that whatever, but that you're actually showing the ability to look at a topic, to set aside biases, and to really come up with some new and original thought about that topic. So in order to do that, you have to know as much about your topic as possible. You have to be able to enter relevant and worldly discussions about your topic, not as an adversary, but as a collaborator. You have to be able to examine your own ideas, and you have to be able to show nuance in your views of the world, that your views of the world and understanding that your views of the world aren't the only ones that exist, nor are they the only ones that you understand. Um, so you have to understand your and others' opinions and biases, and you have to be able to range your viewpoints. Once you've done all of that, then the act of synthesis is simply drawing all of the information together to come up with an informed and original claim. Note that original is not on the slideshow, but it's still it's still a really important aspect of synthesis, that your claim is informed and original. So the key here is that you need to be able to develop unique, mature, relevant viewpoints. Um, argumentation is a start to that, but synthesis, drawing in multiple sources and seeing the connections between those sources and entering the discussion with challenging sources that maybe contradict what you believe, that's kind of the last step to this act of synthesis. Uniqueness, maturity, and relevancy in your viewpoints that go beyond the simplicity of the biases that you may have held before. So with that said, there's an exceptional emphasis placed on sources with synthesis, whereas with um, argumentation, you probably were still using sources. It may have been that you were drawing upon different parts of those sources, or you were even being a little bit biased with how you went about finding those sources in order to make an effective argument. Uh, with synthesis, it's all about using that range of sources uh, and using them skillfully and purposefully. So there are three ways that we use sources skillfully and purposefully. First of all, we make sure to frame those sources. Second of all, we make sure to integrate those sources. And third of all, we make sure to cite those sources. We have this broad range of sources that we're using, and we're using them in this specific way. So I'll give you some background on what I mean by each of those skills, and then I'll show you an example of how those skills can be done. And in order to do that, I'm going to need to use this example claim. So the claim that I'll be using says, summer homework, while well-intentioned, deprives students of an essential element of childhood and should therefore be banned in most cases. So this is an example of a claim that is thoughtful and relevant. It also challenges some of my perspective on the role of summer homework. So I'm trying to show an ability to take into consideration, multiple sources as well as multiple viewpoints. So now let's talk about how we might use evidence with this claim. The first thing that we'll want to do is be able to frame evidence of this claim. So what framing means is that when you talk about the evidence, you're surrounding your quotes, whatever, or your paraphrases, if that's what they are, with analysis and commentary. That you are bringing in, and this is something that we've covered in the past, but it's super important, which is why it's coming back up, that when you discuss the evidence, you're making sure to include the context of the evidence, the function of the evidence, and the application of the evidence. So if we have this quote, which is made up, I just made it up, so don't take this as gospel. But if we have the quote, researchers found that 73% of all students assigned summer homework failed to complete any of it, and then there's this page citation 93, then in order to tie that quote back to the claim, we need to provide context, we need to provide function, and we need to provide application. So I may know that the context of this quote is that it's from a 1993, again made up, 1993 study out of the University of Lasardington, done by I.M. Stuck. And that the function of the quote, what it's actually accomplishing is that it's quantifiable data that's questioning that's questioning the counterclaim. Sorry, I had a little brain brain moment there. And then the application of the quote, how it applies back to um, our claim is that it's supporting the ban of summer homework, which is the last, what is it, the last part of the claim there. So I have the framework for which I need to be able to talk about this quote. I can't just drop the quote in there and expect that the quote makes sense. I have to be able to logically tie the quote back to my ultimate idea. So in order to do that, my framework for that quote is going to be to provide, the context and the function and the application of the quote. My second job then is to take that quote and not only to take the quote, but to take the framework for the quote and to integrate it into my thoughts. So what I mean by integrate is to make sure that your quotes clearly and naturally work with your own writing, or speaking if it's speaking, but usually if it's a formal speech, you will have written it first, second of all. So making sure that you can take all of this information from the framework that you're working with, the quote, the context, the function, and the application, and you can make it sound naturally part or naturally integrated into your own writing or speaking. So it'll look like this. Most teenagers could intuitively tell any teacher what, sorry, let me start that over. Most teenagers could intuitively tell any teacher what researchers out of the University of Lasardington quantified in 1993, that 73% of all students assigned homework failed to complete any of it, Stuck 93. Teachers may not find this reassuring, but it certainly suggests that banning summer homework may actually have little to no effect on actual classroom productivity. So what I've done here is I've taken, the quote, you can see it, I've pared it down to the essential element that I really wanted. I've provided the context you can see as part of my writing. You can also see the function where I talk about this being quantifiable. Where did I say that? Now I've lost it, right? But um, sorry. Um, anyway, it's in there. Uh, um, All right, sorry for that little brain moment that I'm having, but it says quantified in 1993, right? So the function of the quantifiable data, and then the application has its own sentence there down at the end. The last way that we need to use evidence is to make sure that we're citing it. Which should be obvious, but you'd be probably amazed at how many times teachers, including myself, see people use evidence without any form of citation. So at this point, the expectation is especially with your synthesis work, that you're citing all evidence accurately, so that you're giving credit to the people who developed your information, whatever that information you're using, including when you're paraphrasing. Just cite, cite, cite. And, I'm going off of the assumption that this is a skill that you have developed in another class, and that I can just tell you cite your information in some way. You can see from my examples a few different ways of citing if you're unfamiliar with it. But then the last step of that is that you have to include a self-prepared works cited. It's not enough to just give credit within your text. That the expectation is, once we get to something as complex as coming up with new and arguable and original claims and bringing in evidence from multiple sources where you've drawn connections and done all of that, that you simply must include a works cited. It shouldn't be a question. You should never ask a teacher, do I need to include a works cited? Do I have to do this? You should automatically prepare and present a works cited no matter what, and expect penalties if a works cited is not included. It simply is that important, because at this point you're using lots of different information from different people in order to draw your own original conclusions, and you could only have come to that conclusion with their help and with their work. Therefore, you must have a works cited, and please don't use the online works cited machines. You need to know how to prepare a works cited on your own. Those works cited machines often make mistakes or have holes or inaccuracies that could cause you to suffer in terms of your score or your grade, or even be found to have plagiarized and have to redo your work. So the only way to guarantee that a works cited is correct and complete is to make sure that you know how to do it and that you do it on your own, but always, always include it. All right. Sorry for some goofy business in this lesson. I'm trying to keep it to 20 minutes, so I'm going to stop there, but do expect we'll be practicing this in the future.